The restaurant shimmered in golden glass. Every table glowed with candlelight. Every chair was occupied by people who looked like they belonged. Tailored suits, designer dresses, confidence stitched into every word they spoke. And then there was Ella. She stood at the entrance, clutching a second-hand purse with both hands. Her dress was simple, pale blue cotton, slightly wrinkled from the bus ride, and her hair, though brushed, was pulled back in a way that whispered more of effort than elegance. She didn't fit in, and she knew it. The waiter glanced at her twice before approaching. "Ma'am, are you sure you have a reservation?" he asked politely but with that tone, the one that drew a line between people who belonged and those who didn't. "Yes," Ella said softly, showing her phone. "A blind date. Table 7. The waiter's eyebrows lifted slightly when he read the name. "Ah, Mr. Jonathan Hale." That name alone made nearby servers straighten. Everyone knew the name. The CEO of Hale Industries, one of the country's most powerful men. No one could understand what a girl like her was doing here, meeting him. Ella followed the waiter to the table, her heart trembling in her chest. She hadn't wanted to come. It was her best friend's idea, a setup she'd agreed to, only because she was tired of saying no to life. When she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, in a dark suit that looked sculpted just for him, she almost turned around. Jonathan Hale looked like the kind of man who could buy and sell worlds. His cold blue eyes met hers as she sat down, and she could almost feel the weight of his judgment. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of that familiar look of polite dismissal she'd grown used to, Jonathan's gaze softened, just slightly. He noticed the way her hands trembled, the faint tear in the seam of her purse, the vulnerability she wasn't trying to hide. And for a moment, the CEO, who had everything, couldn't look away from the girl who seemed to have nothing. Jonathan didn't speak right away. He simply watched her, like a man trying to understand a puzzle that refused to fit the usual pattern. Most women who sat across from him wore the same expression. Admiration disguised as composure, excitement hidden under expensive perfume. But Ella was different. She looked like she'd stepped into the wrong movie, like she already knew she didn't belong in his world, and didn't plan to pretend otherwise. "Ella, right?" His voice was low, smooth, the kind of tone that could turn a boardroom silent. She nodded, offering a shy smile. "Yes, you must be Jonathan." He leaned back, studying her. "You're—" Not what I expected. There was no insult in his tone, but the words still made her fingers tighten around her glass of water. "I get that a lot," she said, forcing a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Silence stretched between them. The restaurant buzzed around them. Soft laughter, clinking glasses, quiet music. Yet at that table the air felt thick, uncertain. Jonathan's assistant had arranged this blind date, insisting he needed to meet someone normal for once. He'd almost canceled, assuming it would be another gold digger or someone fascinated by the idea of him rather than the man he was. But the moment he saw Ella, something inside him went still. "Tell me about yourself," he said finally. Her answer was simple, unpolished. "There's not much to tell. I work at a bookstore. I like old movies and coffee I can barely afford." She smiled softly. "And I don't really go on dates." He should have smiled politely, made conversation, and left it at that. But her honesty, so quiet, so unguarded, did something strange to him. It tugged at something buried deep beneath years of ambition and control. "You read?" he asked. "All the time," she replied. "Books are the only place that never made me feel out of place." Jonathan's chest tightened. For reasons he couldn't name, those words hit him harder than they should have. He wanted to know why. When their eyes met again, the noise around them faded. The CEO who'd built his empire on power and perfection found himself drawn to imperfection, to a girl whose silence spoke louder than every voice in the room. And for the first time in a long while, Jonathan Hale didn't feel in control. The evening should have ended with polite goodbyes. That's what Ella told herself as she stood outside the restaurant afterward, clutching her coat tighter against the night wind. The city lights flickered on the glass buildings like scattered stars, but she felt small beneath them, like someone accidentally placed in a world too bright for her eyes. She didn't expect him to follow. "Ella." His voice cut through the night air, calm, steady, but something in it made her heartbeat trip. She turned, surprised to see Jonathan walking toward her. Hands in his pockets, the CEO mask replaced by something almost human. "You left quickly," he said. "I didn't want to take more of your time," she answered softly. "People like you usually have better things to do than walk home with strangers." Jonathan almost smiled. "Maybe I wanted to be a stranger for a little while." For a moment, they stood there, a billionaire in a suit worth more than her year's rent, and a girl who couldn't afford a taxi. Yet somehow the space between them didn't feel awkward. It felt real. They walked together in silence, until they reached a small coffee stall glowing. At the corner of the street, the scent of roasted beans filled the cold air. Jonathan ordered 2 cups. Ella protested, but he waved it off. As they stood sipping coffee from paper cups, Jonathan looked at her again. Really looked. Her eyes were tired but kind. There was something fragile about her, but not weak. Something hurt, but still hopeful. "You don't talk much," he said gently. "I've learned that silence keeps people from leaving," she replied. Then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that sounded strange." He shook his head slowly. No, it sounded honest. The honesty in her eyes disarmed him more than any negotiation table ever had. He wasn't used to not being in charge of the moment. But with her, the ground felt different, unfamiliar, maybe even dangerous. When a cab finally arrived, Ella hesitated. "Thank you. For tonight," she said, holding his gaze just long enough for him to see the quiet storm behind her calm. Jonathan nodded, watching her disappear into the night. He didn't know why he cared, or why her leaving felt like something was being taken from him. But he knew one thing. For the first time in years, he wanted to see someone again, not because it made sense, but because it didn't. The next morning, Jonathan Hale did something he never did. He came to work distracted. Meetings blurred together. His assistant spoke in a series of numbers, profits, projections, but his mind kept circling back to the girl in the pale blue dress who drank coffee from a paper cup. He'd met hundreds of women at galas, business dinners, luxury retreats. But Ella's quiet presence lingered like a song he couldn't forget. When his assistant, Lydia, walked in with the day's schedule, Jonathan asked, "Do you still have the file on the blind date arrangement?" Lydia blinked. "Sir?" "The woman from last night, Ella." Lydia's brows lifted. "You want me to?" "Yes, find her." It wasn't a command barked in arrogance. It was a quiet request, wrapped in something even he didn't recognize. Longing. By noon, Lydia returned. "She wasn't registered through any agency, sir. Your friend Michael arranged it privately. Apparently, she's his cousin's friend. Works at a bookstore downtown." Jonathan's hand paused midair. A bookstore. Somehow it fit. Hours later, his sleek black car stopped outside a narrow shop squeezed between 2 buildings. "Page and Whispers Books." The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered. Inside, it smelled of paper and dust and something warm, like safety. Behind the counter, Ella looked up, startled. "Jonathan?" she whispered, as though saying his name too loud might break the spell. He smiled faintly. "You didn't return my message." "I wasn't sure if I should." "Why not?" She hesitated, eyes flickering down. "Because people like you don't come back for people like me." Her words landed between them, gentle yet heavy. Jonathan took a slow step forward. "Maybe you're wrong about that." They stood in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by stories written by others, and somehow, one was beginning to write itself. He picked up a worn copy of The Great Gatsby. "You love books," he said. "Tell me what this one means to you." She looked at the cover thoughtfully. "It's about someone who had everything, except what really mattered." Jonathan's throat tightened. For a man who'd built his life on power and perfection, that line felt like a mirror he didn't want to look into. As he left, he glanced back one last time. Ella was still watching him. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale realized that maybe the one thing money couldn't buy was the feeling he'd just found. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan found himself returning to the bookstore more often than he'd ever planned. At first, he told himself it was for the peace, the smell of ink and old paper, the quiet hum that seemed to drown out the chaos of boardrooms and deals. But he knew better. It was for her. Ella never asked why he came. She'd simply smile softly, hand him a book, and go back to stacking shelves. They spoke little, but their silences were filled with something fragile and alive, like unspoken truths floating in the air between them. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the shop windows, Jonathan asked, "Do you ever think about leaving this place? Doing something bigger?" Ella looked up, her eyes reflecting the gray sky outside. "Bigger doesn't always mean better," she said quietly. "Sometimes peace is the only thing you can afford to keep." Her words stayed with him long after he left. That night, while others drank champagne in crystal halls, Jonathan sat in his penthouse staring at the city below, realizing how empty his empire felt. The next day, he found her reading behind the counter, lost in a book. He leaned against the door frame, watching her for a moment before saying, "You read like the world disappears." She smiled without looking up. "That's the point." He stepped closer. "What are you running from, Ella?" Her fingers froze around the page. The air grew still. "I'm not running," she said finally. "I'm just trying to start over." Jonathan's gaze softened. "From what?" For a heartbeat, she seemed ready to tell him. Her lips parted. Her eyes glistened. But then she shook her head, retreating behind that quiet wall again. It doesn't matter. The past doesn't belong in the present. He wanted to press, to ask who had hurt her, what she was hiding. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "Then let me be part of your present." For the first time, she looked at him. Really looked. And something in her expression cracked. The walls she'd built around her heart trembled, not because he demanded entry, but because he waited gently for her to open the door. Outside, the rain turned heavier, streaking down the window like silver tears. And inside that little bookstore, something quiet and impossible began to take shape. Love. The kind that grows not from lightning, but from the steady warmth of being seen. Jonathan had always believed that people were like books. You could read their surface, understand their chapters, and predict their ending. But Ella was different. Every time he thought he knew her story, a new page appeared, written in ink he couldn't decipher. They had begun meeting outside the bookstore. Coffee in the park, late evening walks, quiet laughter under streetlights. He loved the way she talked about small things, the color of autumn leaves, the smell of rain, the warmth of stray cats sleeping in shop windows. She noticed beauty in places he had never thought to look. But there were moments, sudden and sharp, when her smile faded, when her eyes drifted far away, as if trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. One evening, as they walked along the riverside, he asked softly, "Ella, what happened to you?" She didn't answer at first. The water shimmered under the moonlight, and her reflection trembled. Finally, she whispered, "I used to be married." Jonathan stopped walking. His heartbeat stumbled. "He wasn't kind," she continued, her voice breaking on the edges. "I left with nothing, no money, no friends, just the hope that I could still be someone without him." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Jonathan's chest ached as he listened, the pieces of her past falling into place. Suddenly, the way she hesitated to accept kindness made sense. The way she avoided mirrors, the way she flinched at loud voices. It all spoke of years spent walking on glass. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be," she whispered, looking at him. "You didn't break me." He reached out, hesitating before gently taking her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they didn't pull away. In that moment, Jonathan realized that love wasn't about rescuing someone. It was about staying, about being the safe place they never had. That night, as he drove her home, Ella leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to breathe. But safety is fragile, and in the shadows of the city, a pair of eyes watched them from across the street. Eyes that recognized her. Eyes that belonged to a past she thought she had escaped. Jonathan didn't see. Ella didn't know. But something dark had begun to follow. It began with a single phone call. Ella was at the bookstore, arranging a display of poetry books, when the sound of her old ringtone froze her in place. That melody. She hadn't heard it in years. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. Unknown number. She shouldn't have answered. But she did. "Did you really think you could disappear?" The voice on the other end was sharp, familiar, cold enough to slice through years of silence. Her throat went dry. "Daniel," she whispered. He laughed softly. "So you remember me? I heard you're playing the innocent girl now." Bookstore. Quiet town, new man, cute. Ella's breath shook. "Please, just leave me alone." "You owe me, Ella, and debts don't disappear." The line went dead. That night, she sat on her bed staring at the wall, tears falling silently. For the first time in months, she felt the old fear return, the kind that crawled under her skin and whispered that happiness never lasts. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to her, not as a promise of control, but as a vow of protection. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean on someone. Outside, a shadow lingered in the rain, watching through the glass. Daniel, his eyes burning with the fury of a man who had lost control. As lightning cracked across the sky, Jonathan whispered, "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." But fate, cruel and impatient, was already writing the next chapter. One that would test every word of that promise. It happened 3 nights later. The rain hadn't stopped all day, turning the city into a blur of lights and reflections. Ella was closing the bookstore when the door creaked open. "I'm sorry, we're closed," she said softly, without looking up. But the silence that followed made her freeze. Then came a voice she thought she'd never hear again. Still pretending you belong here? Her breath caught. The book slipped from her hands. Slowly she turned. Daniel stood by the door, soaked, disheveled, but with the same cruel smile that used to haunt her dreams. "Daniel," she whispered. "Please, just leave." He stepped closer, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. "You think you can run off and play the innocent little shop girl? You think I don't know who's been taking care of you lately?" Ella's heart pounded. "Don't bring him into this." Daniel laughed, low and bitter. "Oh, the great Jonathan Hale, I did my research. A man like that doesn't waste time on broken things." The words stabbed deeper than she expected. "You don't know him." He grabbed her wrist, too tight, too familiar. "No, but I know you. You'll always crawl back, Ella. You need someone to fix you. You need me. Let her go." The voice came from the doorway, cold, steady, and furious. Jonathan stood there, rain dripping from his coat. Eyes blazing like a storm given human form. Daniel's grip faltered. "Well, well. The prince arrives. Touch her again," Jonathan said quietly, "and you'll regret breathing." Daniel sneered. "You think money protects you? You don't know what she's done. She lied about everything." "I don't care," Jonathan said, stepping closer. "I know who she is now, and that's enough." For a moment everything was still. Then Daniel swung him, a desperate, angry move. But Jonathan caught his arm and shoved him hard against the counter. "Get out," Jonathan growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Before I make sure you never come back." Daniel's pride cracked, his face pale. He spat something under his breath and stumbled toward the door, slamming it behind him. Ella sank to the floor, shaking. Jonathan dropped beside her, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears falling fast. "You shouldn't have come." He smiled faintly. "I told you, Ella, I'm not going anywhere." Outside, thunder rolled through the night. Inside, she wept into his chest, not from fear this time, but from the realization that someone had finally stayed. But as the storm raged, neither of them knew that Daniel's departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning neither heart was ready for. The days that followed felt heavier than rain. Jonathan had tightened security around the bookstore, hired private protection, and made sure Daniel couldn't come near her again. But fear has a way of echoing. It lingers even after the danger is gone. Ella tried to smile, to return to the quiet rhythm of shelving books and making tea. But something inside her had shifted. She couldn't bear the thought of Jonathan getting hurt because of her past. One evening she found him in his office, sleeves rolled up, his desk cluttered with reports he clearly wasn't reading. "You shouldn't keep doing this for me," she said softly. He looked up. "Doing what?" "Saving me." Jonathan stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. "Ella, you're not something to be saved. You're someone I choose every day, in every way." Her eyes filled. "You don't understand what people will say. You're the man everyone watches. I'm just—" "Don't," he said, taking her hands. "Don't ever say just. You make me human. Ella, you make all of this." He gestured around the shining office. The glass, the skyline mean something. Her tears fell silently, but this time they weren't from pain. In the weeks that followed, the world began to learn the story. Whispers in tabloids, flashes of cameras, cruel headlines that called her the girl who trapped a CEO. Jonathan didn't hide. He walked beside her publicly, hand in hand, his expression calm and defiant. When reporters shouted questions, he simply said, "I don't care what you write about me, but if you hurt her, you'll deal with me." It silenced them. Months passed. Daniel disappeared for good, lost somewhere in the chaos of his own downfall. The scars he left behind would take time to heal, but they no longer defined her. One evening, in that same little bookstore where it all began, Jonathan placed a small box on the counter. Ella blinked at it. "What's this?" He smiled softly. "A new chapter." Inside, instead of a ring, was a key engraved with the words, "Home isn't a place. It's a person." She looked up, trembling. "Jonathan, I want you to know," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you were never nothing. Ella, you were everything I didn't know I needed." And in that moment between the shelves of stories written by others, they began to write their own. A story about two broken people who learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about staying when every reason says to leave. It's about seeing someone truly seeing them and choosing them anyway. As the sun set through the window, painting the room in gold, Ella whispered the only words that ever really mattered. "Thank you for finding me." Jonathan smiled. "No," he said gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You found me." And for once, both of them finally believed it.